Good evening, and welcome to tonight's Commonwealth Club World Affairs program, The Rise of America's Second Civil Rights Movement, featuring Juan Williams.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us to explore the evolution of civil rights in America and the emergence of a new movement in the 21st century. Juan is a prize-winning journalist and historian known for his best-selling civil rights history, Eyes on the Prize, America's Civil Rights Years 1954 to 1965, which accompanied the PBS series of the same name. He is a political analyst for Fox News, having previously worked for NPR and The Washington Post. Now, almost 40 years after Eyes on the Prize, Juan joins us as he releases his new book, New Prize for These Eyes, The Rise of America's Second Civil Rights Movement, exploring the civil rights movement of the past decade. I would even say 2 decades. Juan, welcome.
Thank you, Brian.
So when I experienced Eyes on the Prize a year or two out of college, I remember being blown away by the scope of it, by the reach of the civil rights movement. Not just in the U.S., but in countries around the world. What made you realize that there was a second civil rights movement that needed to be documented?
Well, first of all, thank you, Brian, for being here. And thank you so much to the Commonwealth Club, people of San Francisco, for coming out tonight. This book is important for you as readers because it makes the point that we are in the midst of a second civil rights movement that's having as much impact as the first. And it's really a call for people to open their minds, their eyes to this new prize. One of the realities of the first movement is that it had so much impact. In the way that you just described it, Brian, on you as a young man, you could tell me, oh, I know about Dr. King, I know about the Great March on Washington. These things are iconic in American history and American life. And in a way, because the second movement is not a replica of the first, people are slow to pick up on the idea, yes, something's going on. Something's going on with regard to how we think about race and how we are shaping racial discussions going forward in a very different America. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about.
Please.
In the first movement, you not only had a Dr. King, you had people like A. Philip Randolph, Whitney Young, right? You had people like Roy Wilkins. People would say, oh, that's the leadership. And famously, you had the 1963 March on Washington and the, again, famous I Have a Dream speech. Okay, I am speaking to you here in January of 2025, and I bet everyone in the audience has just said, yeah, we know that. That's true. But what if I said to you, after George Floyd was killed, there were thousands of marches all over the United States with millions of people, more than 26 million, and that's in the United States. And you spoke about the first movement and things that were going on in other countries. Well, this march after the Floyd death was replicated. You could have been in Beijing, you could have been in Paris, you could have been in Buenos Aires. There were marches under the banner of Black Lives Matter. This was a global movement. And just as we talked about there being leadership, clear leadership in the first movement, if I said to you, oh, name the leadership in the second movement, you'd say, I'm not sure. Who would that be? A clear difference in terms of the model. And here's another difference. In the mid-20th century movement, everybody could pick up the paper or turn on the nightly news or the radio and hear what's going on with the civil rights movement. We're now in a movement, and this is like mind-blowing to me, it's 24/7 because it's on the internet.
Right.
It's viral conversations, messages between people, it's images, it's tweets, it's, the whole kind of conversation that doesn't quite have shape or form because everybody's involved. We're talking millions of people all over the country and the world involved in this conversation about race. And of course, America, as another point of contrast, is a different place. Mid-20th century, America was still about 90% white and about 10% black. As we're here today, what we see is Latinos are the biggest minority in the country. Asians are the fastest growing minority in the country. Blacks have increased to about 13% of the population. Whites have decreased to about 60% of the population. And this means that you're having a different dynamic in terms of conversation. It's not just black and white in conversation about race. Now you have different people, different points of view. We have loud arguments about immigration. We have large arguments about gender and about gay rights in the midst of this. This is all part of America going through huge demographic shifts at the same time as we are going through huge political shifts, and overlaying all of it is this second civil rights movement. But again, people are slow to perceive that that's what's taking place.
So what is the new prize? What does this second movement want that's different from what the first movement wanted?
Well, the first movement clearly was about passing a civil rights law. That's why they had the Great March on Washington. You saw Dr. King and others making the case to President Kennedy at the time, but to the Congress, that they needed to pass civil rights laws to enforce the idea that people of any color, but specifically in that case, in that time, black Americans, were deserving of their constitutional rights being protected. And that whole era, the reason the first Eyes on the Prize starts 54 to 65 is because it starts with the Brown decision by the United States Supreme Court making the case that segregation in public schools is not legal. So that whole era is about undoing rigid segregation in American life. Now you fast forward to this movement, and what you see is the agenda differs. The agenda might be, gee, look at mass incarceration remaining so distinctly punitive for blacks, especially black men. Look at income inequality in the country and say, oh my gosh, there's a clear racial overlay to that reality. Or you look at failing schools, especially in low-income black neighborhoods, and you'd say, oh, I thought we had dealt with that. In a way, the second movement is about people saying, we want our lives to reflect the equality that was promised in the first movement, but we don't see reflected in the daily life the reality of what it's like to be a minority in America today. We've made tremendous progress, but it's hard to argue, oh yeah, the job is done. So you see this different kind of appeal being made. I'll just take a second here and say, in my mind, the second movement really begins in 2004 with a speech to the Democratic National Convention by Barack Obama.
And one of my questions is, why do you think that's where it started?
Well, I think, again, I feel like I'm preaching to the choir and saying, I bet everyone in this audience knows about that speech and knows the famous line, we are not a black America and a white America. We're not a Latino America and Asian America. We're the United States of America. Right. And what really stood out there was the optimism of this speech, because whereas in the first movement, a lot of the civil rights rhetoric had to do with, black people have been treated badly, gone through horrors, continue to suffer at the hands of people who are biased. That was the constant coming from black leadership, and that's the constant refrain heard by white ears during that movement. It was an appeal for justice, humanity, moral clarity. Now, here comes this young man, very attractive, very tall, very splendid in terms of his family. And he's saying, thank God for America. My story wouldn't have been possible in any other country but America. Wow. I tell you, I was in the audience as a political journalist, and initially there was lots of clamor in the room, but as he is speaking and as his optimism, his hopeful tone takes hold, you can hear people go silent. They've never seen this kind of appeal on a racial basis. And of course, he goes on to run for president. You remember his poster was hope. What a great, optimistic, forward-looking, it's nothing negative, nothing threatening, nothing that would say to you, oh my gosh, I don't want to see this, it's still such a difficult racial conversation. To the contrary, here was someone saying and suggesting, as the poster did, we are engaged on crossing new horizons into a positive era of race relations, and some people called it the post-racial era, if you'll recall, Brian.
Oh, yeah.
So he wins election, and now Ebony Magazine put on the cover the headline, "In Our Lifetime." I think for you, for me, for so many, it was like, wow, in my lifetime, we just elected a black man as president of the United States. It was an incredible, historic moment. But what you see happen then is that Obama says, I'm not the black president, I'm the president. I'm the president of all the people. I'm the president of the United States. But people who had invested in him this hope that somehow that the black president was going to deliver justice for black people with some sense of urgency, there was a lot of disappointment.
Right. You write that he is one of the most misunderstood presidents of America.
Because I think that not everyone is willing to understand exactly the power that race played in his election. Certainly people celebrated him as a trailblazer, but ultimately he's a politician. He's not a civil rights activist.
Right.
And he's looking to win votes and to try to hold together the coalition that got him elected the first time for winning a second term, and he does that. But when people stop and think, what does his record look like? And they say, oh, well, he had to deal immediately with the financial crisis.
Right.
And then there are arguments because they say he bails out Wall Street but not Main Street. And in the black community, they say, well, if you're bailing out the rich, why aren't you bailing out the disproportionately poor, not just Main Street, but the poor? And he says, no, we're trying to get the country back on track. But there's a racial element to every move that he's making, and it's not attended to in the moment because people are locked into him as the political player. And that's why I say he's misunderstood. But then think of this, Brian. The signature achievement, legislative achievement of his time as president is what was then called the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare. And the argument, again, has this racial overlay where people are saying, you're going to take apart my health insurance coverage, my health insurance plans. You're going to use some of my tax dollars to provide health insurance now for the working poor and the poor. Wait a second, what are you doing? Is this the black president now delivering for a disproportionately black population lacking in that health insurance? Again, that racial context comes into play, and people don't want to talk about it. They want to have arguments about this and that and the other. But to my mind, this is also the start of the backlash.
Right.
The Tea Party. Kind of the populist backlash against Obama. And people are like, well, no, the people have arguments about health care. Well, wait a second, what about this racial argument? And it goes much farther, if you want to think of it in this way, when someone with a platform, Donald Trump, engages in the birther movement and says, this guy's not even a real American. He wasn't born here. And it was like, where'd that come from? Why are you making this argument? We've never even heard. Oh, yeah. He's not an American. Why doesn't he produce his birth certificate and Obama finally has to produce the birth certificate. It's unbelievable. It's almost demeaning of the President of the United States. And then ultimately, of course, the backlash continues to accelerate to the point that Trump succeeds Obama. And in some ways, I make the case in the book that if Black Lives Matter is the name of the second movement, it's also the progenitor of Make America Great Again. Because Make America Great Again is the backlash to having Obama, a black man, as president, and it's the backlash whenever Obama opened his mouth about any racial conflict or controversy in the country. You remember with Trayvon Martin? Yeah. Trayvon Martin is killed, and the man who kills him, a volunteer security guard, then is acquitted, and Black Lives Matter starts. Mm-hmm. And in the midst of it, Obama says, if I had a son, he would have looked like Trayvon. Immediately, the populist anger emerges from people who said, wait a minute, why are you making this a racial issue? This is a law and order issue, and this kid was walking around with a hoodie. He looked threatening. We didn't know what was going on, and he got into a fight. Why do you have to bring race into it? And similarly, when that Harvard professor, Henry Louis Gates, got into a confrontation with a policeman, Gates was coming home from a trip, didn't have his keys, trying to get into his house. The neighbors call, the police come. The police ultimately arrest Gates. And Obama's comment is, why would you arrest a guy trying to get into his own house? That's stupid. Oh, you took the side of the black guy versus the white cop. You're the black president. And after that incident...
Instead of the side of the homeowner trying to get into his own house.
But after that incident, Brian, Obama's rating with white Americans never again got above 50%. So you start to understand, that's why we talked about misunderstood president. I think you have to put it in the context of someone who has an activist role. He's not an activist. He's not a civil rights activist. He's a politician, but he's a central player in this second civil rights movement.
So his speech launches the second civil rights movement, but he's never going to be able to satisfy the movement. The movement is going to be proud that he got elected, but not necessarily happy with what he did.
Well, you advanced my thinking there, Brian. Thank you, because one of the realities, I don't know how much the audience is aware of it, but a lot of the people who are involved with Black Lives Matter really don't have much love for Obama or for politics or for the whole notion of compromise necessary to achieve legislative change. They want immediate, urgent action in the name of racial justice. So if someone is killed like a Trayvon Martin, or you go forward, an Eric Garner, or ultimately someone like George Floyd, they want action. And they're looking at the idea that there's a black man in the Oval Office. In a way, that's the prime achievement of the first civil rights movement, making it possible with the Voting Rights Act to protect the right of black people to vote, and ultimately to have black politicians who act in the best interest of black people. And now, in our lifetime, there's a black man at the top of the political order, the president. And they're expecting him to act swiftly. And they're not seeing it, and they are somewhat disillusioned and even disgusted with the idea that, well, I thought this was going to be the big deal. We got, the older generation talks about, wow, look at what happened in the first movement. Look at the progress. Look at the changes. And people are saying, well, I don't know. Seems to me like I still go to bad schools. My children go to bad schools. Seems to me like we still have income inequality in the country. Seems to me like there is a big gap when it comes to the experience of being black, white in this country. And they are sort of turned off. And the other side of it is, you have people who are looking at Obama and absolutely outraged at the small steps he takes in terms of race. So I mentioned before the change with media, how we went to the viral sensation and how people are engaged online and how Black Lives Matter organized online. But you also have the white militia movement organizing online.
Right.
The Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, Breitbart, you remember Steve Bannon said, we are now the platform for the alt-right.
Right.
And you have these incredible moments right after Trump is elected in Charlottesville with people marching with tiki torches and saying Jews will not replace us, angry over monuments being shifted, Confederate monuments to new monuments, and people saying it's time to get away from that Confederate slaveholder mentality. And these people are angry, they're organized and well-funded, and they are also battling against Black Lives Matter. And so when you said to me at the very start of our conversation, you know, why did you feel the need now? It seems to me, and maybe because I did Eyes on the Prize, the original 40 years ago, I'm watching this and I'm seeing it in the way that you talked about it, Brian. There's a panorama here of tremendous historic drama with regard to race in this moment in American life. Mm. And for some reason, people aren't grasping what's going on. But I think if you ask them to stop and just appreciate the significance of what could be taken as individual events, isolated moments, you can see the larger picture. Right. And the larger picture is a second movement.
Let me lurch to the present or the sort of immediate past and ask you, what do you make of the gains that Trump made with black voters in 2024? And I mean, do these gains with black voters and Latinos and, you know, other communities of color suggest that we might have gotten to a post-racial America, just not kind of the way we might have been envisioning it with Obama?
No, I don't think so, but I think it's, you know, the facts are the facts. He won 25% of young black men. They voted for Donald Trump. And if you're talking about Latinos, it's about half of the men voted for Donald Trump. Now, it's also the case, just to have everything in proper perspective, 80+% of black voters in the United States voted for Kamala Harris. And I believe it's high 50s, almost 60% of Latino people voted for Kamala Harris. And similarly, numbers with Asians, by the way. But if you compare it to Donald Trump, you'd say Donald Trump did better in 2024 with minorities than he did in 2020. And you'd ask, well, how's that possible? Which is what I think you're driving at. And I think there is a sense, going back to second movement, there's a sense among young people, and I think especially young men of color, that, gee, I don't think my life is going all that great. I don't see any huge changes. The Democrats promise this, that, and the other, and they say, don't vote for this guy. He's so terrible. He's so racist. But he is much more of a fighter, a change agent, a disruptor in terms of the political scene. And why not try something? What the hell? Remember, Trump had the famous phrase, the last book I wrote about this, it was called, What the Hell Do You Have to Lose? That's what he said at the time. Of course, Trump has said that he's the Abraham Lincoln of this time. Remember Joe Biden had said, yeah, Abe Lincoln here, remember that? But I think there are young people, again, so disillusioned with politics, the political process, with the system as they see it. They're just anxious to have everything disrupted in the hope that something good's going to happen for them or they get a break somehow. To me, this is the height of frustration and almost dysfunction. I just don't understand how they can ignore what is a pretty clear record of sort of racial rancor attached to President Trump. And we talked about the birther movement. I can go farther back in Central Park 5, but how about I come forward in time and I start reminding people what he said about Latino immigrants as criminals and rapists, right? Or start talking about, oh, those Haitian immigrants are eating pets. remember this. This happened in the last campaign. Or you hear how he talks about Kamala Harris as dumb, the way he talks about, I could go on. But my point is, you have to, even if you are not the most political person in America, and you're not on a constant diet of listening to Brian and the news, you would have to say, I think there's something going on with race in this Trump guy. And you have to then make the logical step to say, but it's not as important to me as the disruption, the chaos. He might do something different because I don't like what's going on right now. And I think that's what it is. I think that's what took place.
Since you talked about backlash, the whole notion of backlash is very, very prominent in this book. And really all I heard ringing loudly through the inauguration speech on Monday, 2 days ago, it was backlash. Just backlash to progress that might have been made or just gains that maybe President Biden might have done. But I get the sense that this second civil rights movement hasn't quite figured out how to manage backlash. Do you think it's got to figure that out?
That's right. And I think that at the moment there's a lot of despair. People feel despondent. How could he have won? Now that he's won, you don't see the big march in the way that we saw in 2017 when he was first inaugurated for the first term.
Yeah.
And I think people feel a little bit at sea. Now, when you think of it in terms of second movement and civil rights, it's again hard not to put the dots together, at least from my perspective. In the inaugural speech that he gave just this week, he says very clearly, I got more votes from the Black and Latino community, and I'm going to work with you. And then he goes on to say, but when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion, we are going to stop this. And we have seen him subsequently issue orders to end all federal efforts to do a better job of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And to me, again, I said to you, I think that there is Black Lives Matter as a movement, and the counterforce is MAGA. And you think about when we had the big marches especially after George Floyd's death, marches in which, by the way, according to Pew and Gallup, 60% of white America supported Black Lives Matter at that point. 70% of Latino America supported Black Lives Matter, 80+% of Black America. Trump undermined it by saying, oh, look, there's some incidents of violence. There's Antifa. These people are radical leftists, and they're a threat to you and me. And when you walk down the street, these are the people who want to burn down your small business or they want to mug you. Don't think these are good people. Now, overwhelmingly, not just by my measure, but by people who track demonstrations and protests, these were not only the largest protest in American history, they were also the most peaceful. But Trump changed the whole narrative to one in which you had to worry, and as he put it, when the looting starts, the shooting starts. Now you're having a different conversation, a different understanding of what's going on.
Why do you think that's so easy for him?
Well, let me finish this
All
thought.
right, yeah, go ahead. Oh, yeah.
Because where I was going was DEI. What he says about diversity, equity, and inclusion is not that it's an effort to make sure that there is a level playing field for everyone in America, and that it's not just that tall white males who are highly educated at expensive schools are going to be in the leadership class, but that we have opportunities for people who might be great achievers, but just women, Black, gays, Latinos, Asian. And he says, no. This is reverse discrimination, and that people who are achievers are being denied proper reward because the focus is on quotas And we go, wait, who said anything about quotas? We're talking about repairing what is a clear history of people of color and women not having equal opportunity when it came to jobs and even admission to college and universities. And you're saying, yeah, we want to make sure that there's a more equitable playing field. And instead now, the whole conversation shifts to something that he quickly labels, and I think successfully to your point, as identity politics. And people say, oh my God, identity politics is sinking the Democratic Party. Why did they ever get involved with identity politics? You think, wait a minute, who is the number one progenitor of identity politics in America today? I would say it's Donald Trump. And it's white grievance politics saying someone is taking your job, someone's taking your tax dollars, someone is devastating your community and not looking out for you, and they're eating your pets. Right? And we don't want people of color from S-hole countries coming in here, but we sure could use more Scandinavians. I mean, it's hard to ignore it. As I said, it's like, you go outside and you say, it's raining, it's a little bit of sleet. Hey, I think it's snowing. I think there's a second movement going on.
Mm-hmm. Since we're in the Bay Area, I was struck by how strong elements of, one, the second civil rights movement, but also the backlash against it come from here. Or, they're sort of part of the origin. And Black Lives Matter is Alicia Garza in Oakland. That right. Hashtag was started.
Right there.
Right there. And in reaction to something that didn't happen here.
In Florida, Trayvon Martin.
Right. But then you also write about Jose Garcia Zarate's situation here with Kate Steinle.
Absolutely.
Not far from where we are
Port of
right
San
now.
Francisco, yeah.
That is really what fueled the white backlash. And Donald Trump really took that and ran with it. I mean, that was the fuel of his campaign for a while.
And again, the whole notion is immigrants coming and taking advantage of white people, decent, hardworking white people. And you'll note, by the way, Brian, the first piece of legislation that they're going to get through is for this young woman, Laken Riley, who was killed by an illegal immigrant. Right. And what you get is in the conversation in Washington is Democrats are now willing to work and vote for this piece of legislation because they realize how powerful the immigration issue has been in elevating Donald Trump to a second term as president of the United States. Well, I don't think there's much argument from anybody that you don't want criminals on the street. If you can do anything to rein in criminals, do it. And if the criminals are illegal immigrants, yes, take action. But it's telling, again, in the course of our discussion of a second civil rights movement, how Trump refused the opportunity to support bipartisan immigration reform before the campaign. He saw it as, again, a tremendous whipping boy that could be used to stir up his base, his MAGA base. So he wanted that issue protected, and even when you had conservative Republicans say, here is a deal that we could buy into, Trump said no. So the issue continued, and of course, it extends beyond. This is the thing about living in such a diverse America as we are in this century. The most powerful ad of the campaign was about a Latino-looking transgender person in jail, illegal immigrant who is being given sex change surgery, and he has Kamala Harris saying, yes, I support, it's the law, we'll support this person. And Trump says, she's with they, them, and I'm with you. Wow. Now talk about racial overlay, and again, extending beyond race in specific, but the argument, the notion of grievance, the notion that you are being victimized by these people who have come into the country, not only illegally, but legally, and by these radical leftists, these Black Lives Matter people, not forgetting that so many people across racial lines supported the idea that you can't have police just beating and killing and kneeling on someone's neck for 9 minutes. No, now the conversation shifts in a way that allows Trump to exploit it for political advantage. And that I think you were suggesting, how does he do this? How does he continue to do this?
Well, but I also feel like this is, we have, it feels like a riddle that is hard for the second civil rights movement to solve. How do you talk about race constructively, productively, without just getting in all kinds of trouble? And how does the other side get to talk about race all they want? Or at least put it out there in a way that scares people without sort of being held to the same consequence. It's almost like the Trump side or the MAGA side gets to say, hey, they're doing identity politics, when in reality it's them. I mean, I guess it's that, and so there's a riddle that that confounds me, as someone who kind of watches from the side.
Right.
And I'm trying to figure out how the second movement deals with that. They just seem unable to kind of overcome that, to take the conversation back to a constructive place rather than a place that's filled with so much hate and venom.
Well, I think that it starts with people who are involved with progressive causes across the board, saying, we've got to be more politically involved. And what does that mean? You can't just have a kind of disdain for politicians or for people who engage in compromise or people who talk about gradual change. You can't just be insistent on immediate results and then say, the system doesn't work for me. And too often I think that's been the case. And the result is that people like Joe Biden, who puts a black woman on the Supreme Court, who tries to get police reform passed but is stopped by the Republicans, or Barack Obama, who passes a tremendous health care plan that is still in place despite constant attacks by Republicans, that instead of saying, but he didn't do this, and I don't understand that, and why haven't things changed more quickly, that you would see people on the left say, we're going to work together. You'd be surprised at the level of unity in the MAGA world, to the point of silencing what I think is the traditional Republican Party. I don't even think that Republican Party has voice anymore. What exists is the party of Trump. It's Trump's party, and you see it in the House and in the Senate. You see all the divisions and Freedom Caucus and all that. All that can get settled under Trump's stern hold. But on the left, you see the cracks, the divisions, the sense of, I don't think this works for me, come into play. Why is it that, and I think this is the failure of Black Lives Matter in so many ways, why didn't they do more in terms of outreach to Latinos, to Asians, right? Why isn't there more outreach? The tremendous support that I mentioned after the George Floyd death. You still have more than 50% of Americans approving of Black Lives Matter as an idea, but they don't know what it's doing. There's no messaging. There's a sense that the money that went in there oftentimes just disappeared or was corruptly used to feather pockets. This is not helpful.
No.
This makes people feel like, well, gee, I'm not sure what's going on with those folks. And then you have Trump conveniently jumping on and saying they're violent, they're Antifa, they're crazy, they're radicals. And he's defining them, even as they are intentionally saying, we don't want to define ourselves, we don't want hierarchical leadership, We don't want patriarchal leadership. We want to try to make our case very flatly and demand that people respond. No, you've got to be involved in the politics of it. I said earlier, Obama's not a civil rights activist. He's a politician. And yet, in so many ways, you'd say he's the most outstanding figure during this second civil rights movement. Some people said to me, well, what about, Alicia Garza, Patrisse Cullors, Opal Tometi, all these? I said, yeah, but they have quite intentionally receded from any leadership position. And
It's almost like they wanted it to be decentralized.
Absolutely. After Ferguson, after the Michael Brown killing, they say, you know what? If you're in San Francisco, you understand the civil rights issues, the racial issues in your town. You set the agenda. You do your thing, and you can have the Black Lives Matter title. Or if you're in St. Louis or Miami, San Diego, you do your own thing. Well, the result is you get a diffused movement while MAGA and Trump are quite central.
The opposite of
and the profile is high. That's a big difference. I think you've got to have some centralized effort, and you've got to get people working together. And if you're in the pro-abortion rights movement, I think Black Lives Matter should be reaching out to you. I think if you're in the gay rights movement, it should be that Black Lives Matter says, you know what, we have got something special here, and we want to work with you. I think that if you are dealing with mass incarceration, if you're dealing with people who are looking to improve the quality of public schools, or people who are fighting against police brutality, those forces have to come together, have to find common bonds and common purpose. And right now, they don't have it.
I was struck by how Black Lives Matter wouldn't go all in with Hillary.
Right.
Once Biden prevailed in South Carolina, they suddenly were all in. It's almost as if the Black Lives Matter movement had to learn that you got to be voting for somebody. We have to get people out to vote in support of someone.
If you believe in the political structure, if you believe in the system, and a lot of these people clearly said they don't believe in the system. They don't believe in politics. It's like in the state of Maryland right now, you have a black governor. They just elected a black senator. The mayor of the biggest city, Baltimore, is a black person. And yet, in all honesty, if you ask people about living in the city of Baltimore and the state of Maryland, they tell you it's a pretty difficult experience for poor black people, high population of poverty, poor quality schools, and lots of violence. And you'd say, what is it that failed in this message about black politicians delivering for black people, and especially for young people who weren't involved in the first movement and are asking, why am I not seeing more of what the older generation is celebrating? More results from what the older generation is celebrating. And again, I think this is part of the engine of discontent on the left, that the younger generation is really disillusioned with the productivity, the result of black political power.
Let me change topics and ask you about social media, because you actually have a lot to say in your book about the role that social media plays in this second civil rights movement. And you actually talk about how a group like Color of Change, for example, could actually push Facebook to make certain changes in order to protect African Americans on the Facebook platform. But social media has made a big shift, really, here in the last month or even days.
A picture's worth 1,000 words. There's Musk, right? Zuckerberg, Bezos, right? They're all there, and they've all put big money into Trump, and they don't want any regulation of content. And, Zuckerberg says now they're not even going to fact check, right? It's just up to the crowd. You can say what you want, you say what you want. That's going to be a real cesspool, it seems to me, of hatred and division. And I imagine that the Russians and the Chinese are thinking, oh, this is great. We can use this too. But on the right, it's all taken in terms of an effort at censorship when you talk about social media regulation or moderation, maybe is the way to put it. And, again, I speak here not only as a black person and someone writing about what I think of as the second movement, but I speak as a parent, and I think about this social media and the impact it's had on daughters and the impact it's had on young people and the kind of filth and moral corruption that is fomented there. And I think, why isn't there a will on the part of the American people to insist that this be regulated? We regulate even content coming over the air for broadcast, but there's no moderation of what's going out on the internet. It's madness. But instead, and especially in this moment, Trump has dominated that social media space, especially on the right, made it into his echo chamber, and now it's reached the point where, having once said TikTok is a threat to national security, he has changed his tune and now says he's trying to find a way to keep TikTok going, maybe not under Chinese leadership, but under American ownership. And why? Because he sees it as having helped him, and it's part of his domination of social media content, which, of course, initially, as I say in the book, was such a boost to Black Lives Matter.
I seem to remember TikTok being a real adversary to Trump 4 years ago. It was
Right.
through TikTok that there were all these little shenanigans played on the Trump campaign, and that's why I thought he wanted to ban it. Aside from...
Well, he probably did. Probably you're right. But again, what has happened is there has been a shift, and he now sees it as something that is a positive politically for him.
We have some questions from the audience, and I want to make sure I ask them. Here's one. Movements need leaders. Who do you think will or should ideally step forward to lead the second civil rights movement?
So in the way that we've been talking about the absence of activist leadership, if we went back to the form of the first civil rights movement with the Dr. Kings and the Whitney Youngs and the like, even the John Lewis, was head of the SNCC movement, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. You come forward, and I don't see that kind of leadership in place. It's a different time, a different demographic mix in America, a different political reality in America. But I see people like Stacey Abrams down in Georgia, who's been fighting voter suppression. I think she's a real leader. But she's a politician. She was in the state legislature, ran for governor unsuccessfully. We talked about Obama, not a civil rights activist, but a leading figure in this second movement as a politician. And part of my thinking, and this is the answer to your previous question, is that the activist community have to get off their high horse, really, and say, we got to work with the black politicians, the Latino politicians, the Asian. We got to work with white politicians who are people attuned to the notion of a fight for social justice in America and for an equal and level playing field when it comes to opportunity. This, to me, is the cry for the moment. This is the goal. You asked at the very start, what is the goal of the second civil rights movement? It's fulfilling the promise of the first by having the lived experience for people of color, for women, for people who are gender uncertain, trying to find their way, to have them feel secure in the pursuit of equal justice under law as citizens of this country. And right now, they don't have that security, and I think especially after the inauguration speech of the second term for President Trump, there is more anxiety, more despondent people right now feeling literally scared in some cases about what's to come. So that second movement has to counter, has to find the way to get in this fight while keeping a firm eye on the prize.
Here's another question. What type of civil rights gains and black progress do you think might be made as a backlash to this Trump era?
I can't see it right now because I think we're still, I mean, as I said, when I see what he's trying to do to the whole, it's almost such a benign idea. Diversity, equity, inclusion. It doesn't sound very rash to me. It sounds like, oh yeah, we all believe in that. That's kind of like, motherhood and apple pie. It's pretty good. Let's have a equitable, inclusive society. And let's have a society in which we are already so mixed. I mean, it's the glory of America in some ways. And you look at what people bring and who comes here, and we need to have a better sense of control of illegal immigration. We need to reform our immigration system, but there's no need to be so polarized over it. It's not as if there's a large group of Americans who say, oh yeah, we don't want borders and we want bad people coming in. And it's just an outright lie to say, oh, Democrats want them to come in because we think they'll vote Democrats. Or it's an outright lie to say, oh, we're bringing in these people as part of, and this is a very real theory on the right, it's a replacement theory. They're bringing them in to replace white people, right? And it's just like Jews will not replace us, the Latinos will not replace the blacks. I mean, but again, to me, diversity, equity, inclusion should be like, well, yeah, but it's how we go about it. Let's have a conversation about it. Let's make sure that we're not penalizing people who are hardworking achievers, and we're not somehow diminishing them and excluding them on the basis of any race, be they white, black, or whatever. So to me, you've got to take control. And you said, how do you counter it? And I think, again, you got to get involved with the politics and say that winning matters. Elections obviously have consequences, as the cliche goes. And say, we want to win elections. And that people like Joe Biden did a lot. It may not have done everything you wanted, but goodness gracious, what a contrast to the chaos, to the division that we are seeing fomented at this moment under this current president.
I decided to make a list of a few things that have happened in the last 36 hours. We are, I guess we are now 48 hours since the actual inauguration, beyond that. But in the last 36 hours, pardoning or commuting sentences of 1,500 January 6, 2021.
Exactly. Blue Lives Matter for who now?
Right.
Wow.
Revoking a 60-year-old executive order banning discrimination in hiring practices in the government. Office of Management and Budget is directing U.S. agencies to put staff in DEI roles on paid leave, and that all federal DEI programs offices are being shut down. Giving Immigration and Customs Enforcement clearance to enter schools, health facilities, and places of worship to make arrests, and moves to eliminate birthright citizenship. I wanted to lay this list out because I wanted to ask you if you think there will be a moment when this gets perceived as overreaching. Can Trump go too far in the minds of even people who voted for him?
Well, I didn't vote for him. So I can't give you an accurate vision of this, but I will say that if you look at his ranking, his approval rating right now, as we sit here, well, no, actually, before he was inaugurated, it was close to 50%. Remember, he got just slightly less than 50% of the popular vote. Although he won the popular vote, it was still slightly less than 50. But his approval rating at the time of his inauguration was about 50%. And you say, well, that's the highest it's ever been in the United States. Half the population, I think, almost on a honeymoon type experience, saying, okay, he won, let's work with him. But you watch right now, if you look back historically at Bush went down within the first, by this August, only about 2 or 3 points. But Obama went down like 17 points, right? Mm. And Trump in his first time went down 20 plus points. what you see is there's a quick drop-off for all of these guys. And I think that the behavior exhibited by Trump, as you say, going too far, is really pushing away a lot of the swing voters who said, we don't like the status quo, we want to change, we want something different. Well, I don't think they are going to be too happy with this. In terms of the base, however, that's different. I think that they are locked into Trump. You know, we're talking about diversity, equity, inclusion. So much conversation about the nominee for defense secretary. And I think to myself, this is unbelievable. We're having arguments and conversation about his personal behavior, but what about his qualifications? If this was a woman or a black person, I think we'd say, oh my God, this must be a DEI hire. Because where is the qualification of this person to run the Department of Defense, the biggest department in the federal government, the biggest budget, responsible for world peace? I just don't see it.
This is actually a great question coming out of that from the audience. Is there any possibility of outreach or overlap in priorities between the current civil rights movement and some of Trump's voters?
Yes. I think that if you look back over the last decade of American politics, including Obama, the populist urge is very clear on the left and the right. I always think of Bernie Sanders and remind people how popular Bernie Sanders is in the Democratic ranks, Elizabeth Warren. And the thing about this is Obama was seen as a populist game changer when he ran in 2008, and he tried to maintain that image in 2012, and he did so successfully. The populist urge and instinct, as we see it reflected on the right, has a close relationship with people who say, we want to do something about income inequality. We want to do something about high cost of prescription drugs. We want to do something about poor quality schools for so many kids. That's populist rage and saying, why isn't the structure doing, but think about jobs. Why did so many jobs go overseas? And why is it that manufacturing was decimated in some areas, Main Street hollowed out, and Walmart comes in and all that? You say that people across racial lines, across political lines, share in this kind of angst, if you will. And the question is, why has it been that the right and Trump have been able to capitalize on this in a way that the left has not?
I like this question because I know it comes from deep in the bones of the asker.
Okay.
Because I can just feel it when I read it. How do you engage the 92% of black women who are resting for the next 4 years? They have carried the weight and they are tired.
Well, what's that famous saying from the first civil rights movement? My bones are tired, but my soul is rested, And I think if you look at black women as the base of the Democratic Party, you're exactly right. And you could make the case that they have carried the Democratic Party for so long. But what is the option? What is the option? Especially, we talked about the inroads that the Trump folks have made with young black men who have discouraged and disillusioned, apparently, with all politics. It seems to me that what you have to say is we have a country that should look up to black women as models of how you achieve social change and how we could get the second movement back on track. And not simply say, oh, we put too much weight on them, but say, that's the kind of heroic effort that's necessary in this moment. What can we learn from what has happened with black women? And their activism and their willingness to engage with politics and often to win, right? To win. That's a very important thing to say. It's not, I mean, in this moment, everybody feels discouraged because of the Trump victory and taking office. But you stop and think about the victories for black women over the last decade or so, and you'd say, wow, they are making a difference. And I think it's just very important.
By the end of your book, you are starting to say that there will be a third civil rights movement. I wanted to ask you, what do you think the third movement's priorities will be?
Well, right now, winning political elections. I don't think there's any question. You have got to make the case, and I think make the case to some of those Trump voters, that their best interest in this multiracial sort of, kaleidoscope demographic mix that is America's future, that their best interest is in racial peace and unity in this country, and in honest conversations about everything from crime. Why is it that if Brian and Juan go to dinner, should we not feel threatened by some kid coming towards us who looks like he's homeless and drug addicted and crazy? Of course we're going to feel threatened, and we're black, right? But if you're white and you say, I feel threatened, there are people who say, oh, no, don't, we have to be sensitive. Yeah, we do have to be sensitive. We have to have that conversation, but we also have to say, you have a right to feel safe in your own community, right? And for me, I have a right to feel safe in terms of the police, but I also have a right to feel safe in terms of young people who would mug me or kill me or shoot me, gun violence being what it is. That's another part of this conversation. These are difficult but important conversations. And when we are thinking about a third civil rights movement and building coalitions, reaching out, to the Bernie Sanders, to the populist John Fetterman kind of white base that is tending towards Trump at the moment, we have to have the willingness to engage in those conversations honestly. And again, we have to be willing to compromise. We have to be willing to look towards legislative victories and political victories. That, to me, is the key to the coming movement, that the people at the activist edge who have been so solely focused on race might somehow shift and say, you know what? We have to focus on common ground and building coalitions to a greater end, a greater result.
Juan, thank you.
My pleasure. Nice to be with you, Brian.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you for listening.
Thank you also to the audience. Thank you for your questions. Very thoughtful. Juan will be signing copies of his book in the lounge outside of the auditorium very shortly. And finally, Commonwealth Club World Affairs warmly encourages you to attend future programs, to become a member, and to support the mission to foster vital civic education, engagement, and dialogue. To find out more, please visit the website www.commonwealthclub.org. Thank you, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.